Operation Cobra, 1944. The beginning of the Great Breakthrough. They say the sky can fall on you when you least expect it. I never really understood that saying until the morning of July 25th, 1944, when the heavens over Normandy cracked open and rained fire upon the earth. My name is Louis Gardner, Private First Class, 30th Infantry Division, United States Army. I had survived the bocage for weeks, the thick, hellish maze of hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress and every village into a death trap. But nothing prepared me for what we were about to unleash and what it would cost us. This is my story, or at least the pieces of it I can still hold on to. The night before the operation, the fields around our bivouac near La Chapelle were choked with mist, thick and cold as the sweat on the back of my neck. The whole division was pulled back, and we waited, jammed together in shallow foxholes, gear clinking softly, whispered prayers or curses hanging in the damp air. Orders had come down, massive air support at dawn, then a full push to break out of this cursed hedgerow country. It sounded simple on paper, but anyone who had tasted real combat knew that plans were just fragile ideas, easily torn apart by the first burst of enemy fire. I lay there that night staring at a sky pricked with stars, wondering if I'd ever see them again. Somewhere out there, in the dark, German units dug in deep, their machine guns silent but ready. I pictured them as invisible wolves, crouched just beyond the next hedge, their teeth gleaming in the dark. I closed my eyes and thought of home, on my mother's kitchen in Des Moines, the way the floor creaked under her feet, the smell of apple pie cooling on the windowsill. It felt like a lifetime away. Maybe it was. The first planes came at dawn. First a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar, until the very air seemed to shudder and break apart. I pulled my helmet tighter down over my ears as the ground trembled under me. Thousands of American and British bombers, like swarms of iron locusts, flew overhead in wave after wave, their bellies opening to spew their deadly cargo. The sky turned black with smoke and dirt, and the ground ahead of us was ripped and torn like paper in a storm. We were supposed to wait until the bombers finished before we moved forward, but even from where we lay, hidden in the folds of the earth, the concussion was overwhelming. Some of the bombs fell short, hammering our own lines. I remember the sickening thud of a blast a few yards to my left, and when the dust cleared, the foxhole there was just gone. No sign of the two guys who had been huddled in it. No screaming, no movement. Just a ragged hole in the earth and the smell of charred flesh. There was a signal, a red flare shot into the air, and that was our cue. I scrambled out of the foxhole with the others, my heart hammering so hard it drowned out the sound of the battle for a moment. Ahead, the landscape was unrecognizable. Trees splintered to stumps, hedgerows shredded to tangled wire and mud, craters big enough to swallow trucks. We charged forward through the smoke, stumbling over broken earth and bodies, our rifles clenched tight in white-knuckled hands. I stuck close to Sergeant Michaels, a wiry man from Kentucky who had a knack for survival and a dry, almost cruel sense of humor. His voice barked out commands, half lost in the chaos. I could barely hear him, but I followed his silhouette through the shifting smoke like it was my lifeline. Every few feet we had to dive into a crater or behind a shattered hedge as German machine guns opened up from somewhere ahead, the bullets snapping past our ears like angry wasps. At one point, as we crossed what had once been a wheat field, a Panzer tank loomed out of the smoke, its guns swiveling toward us. Time seemed to freeze. I swear I could see the glint of sunlight on the gunner's goggles, the faint trace of a sneer on his face. Then came the roar of our own Sherman tanks, bursting from cover on the left flank, guns blazing. One of the Shermans took a direct hit from the Panzer and erupted in a fountain of fire and metal. The blast hurled me to the ground, my ears ringing, my mouth full of grit. Somehow we kept moving. Through a shell of a village, St. Gilles, I think it was called, though it barely looked like a place humans had ever lived. Stone walls crumbled, the air thick with the metallic stink of blood and the sharp bite of cordite. We fought house to house, room to room, sometimes hand to hand, the enemy hidden among the ruins like ghosts. Every shadow was a threat, every sudden noise a possible death. The craziest part was there were moments, split seconds really, when the absurdity of it all almost made me laugh. Like when Corporal Jenkins, trying to duck under a fallen beam, caught his pack and ended up dangling there like a fish on a line, cussing up a storm in that high-pitched Tennessee drawl of his. Or when Private Alvarez, dodging sniper fire, tripped over a goat, of all things, and somehow managed to bayonet a German soldier hiding in a cellar purely by accident. But laughter in a place like that was thin and brittle, a fragile thing that could shatter with a single bullet. And the bullets kept coming. As the day dragged on, the sun burned away the last of the mist, and the heat set in with a vengeance. Sweat poured down my back, soaking my uniform, mixing with the grime and blood. I lost track of how many hedgerows we crossed, how many fields we fought through, how many men we left behind in the dirt. The only measure of time was the growing ache in my legs, the sting of cordite in my lungs, the slow, relentless advance toward something. Toward freedom, maybe. Toward death. Hard to say which, sometimes. By late afternoon, we had pushed several miles into what had been solid German-held territory just that morning. But the deeper we went, the fiercer the resistance grew. It was as if the Wehrmacht had been waiting for us, letting the bombs soften their lines but preparing their strongest defenses farther back. And that's when we saw it. A low ridge, crowned with what looked like the remains of a stone monastery, standing stark against the blood-red sky. From there, heavy machine guns and mortars rained fire down onto our battered lines. Every instinct screamed at me to find cover, to dig in, to wait for the tanks or the artillery to catch up. But the order came down the line, clear and brutal. Take that ridge at all costs. And so, with our boots sinking into the churned mud and our souls weighed down by exhaustion and fear, we gathered for one last charge. The ridge waited, silent and deadly, under a sky that seemed to bleed fire. And somewhere deep inside me, a voice whispered that if I took one more step forward, there might be no coming back. But there was no choice. Not anymore. The signal to advance came not with a shout or a blast of a whistle, but with a grim, steady forward movement of the line itself, a slow, reluctant tidal wave of worn-out men clutching rifles in bloodied hands, pushing forward into a storm they could not see the end of. My feet moved before my mind could catch up, and the world narrowed to the rough feel of the rifles with stock in my hands, the sharp stink of sweat and powder thick in the air, the thudding chorus of artillery pounding somewhere behind us like the distant heartbeat of some ancient god. We moved as one, stumbling over churned-up earth and twisted metal, weaving through the shattered skeletons of trees that jutted up from the mud like broken fingers clawing at the sky. The enemy on that ridge did not wait politely for us to reach them. The moment we stepped into the open ground leading up to it, all hell opened up. Machine guns stitched the air with invisible lines of death, mortar shells burst with bone-rattling fury all around us, and somewhere to the right, the distinct bark of a German 88mm cannon cracked the sky like a whip, its rounds tearing huge wounds in the earth and anything unfortunate enough to be standing on it. Men went down around me like marionettes with their strings cut, some crying out, most falling in a terrible, numbing silence that was somehow worse. I hugged the ground instinctively, my face pressed into the warm, gritty mud, trying to make myself as small and unimportant a target as possible. Bullets snapped and whined overhead, occasionally striking with a sickening thud into something soft. Somewhere nearby, Sergeant Michaels was shouting something, encouragement maybe, or orders, but the words were torn away by the din before they could reach me. All I knew was that we had to move, somehow, someway, or die right here, pinned like insects under the cruel gaze of the guns on that ridge. It took everything I had to push myself up and scramble forward a few feet at a time, using the shallow craters and the broken remains of farm equipment for cover. I caught fleeting glimpses of the others, Alvarez with his helmet askew, blood trickling from a gash above his eye, crawling like a man possessed, Jenkins dragging one leg behind him, but still moving, still clutching that battered Springfield rifle like it was the only thing anchoring him to this world. Death walked with us, silent and patient, brushing shoulders with us every time a shell exploded too close or a bullet screamed past too near. The climb to the ridge felt endless, each step harder than the last, as if the earth itself was trying to pull us back down. My breath rasped in my throat, my heart hammered so loudly in my ears that it drowned out even the gunfire. I saw men collapse from exhaustion, from wounds they could not ignore any longer, and still we pressed on, driven by something beyond orders or fear or even hope, something deeper, more primal. The need to survive, perhaps, or the stubborn refusal to let the bastards on that ridge be the ones to write the final chapter of our story. By the time we reached the base of the ridge, I had lost track of who was still with us. The smoke was so thick that the world had shrunk to a few feet in any direction, a shifting, ghostly battlefield where friends and enemies alike appeared and vanished without warning. I stumbled over bodies, some German, some American, all equally broken and still. My fingers found purchase on the rough stones of the slope, and I began to climb, half crawling, half dragging myself upward. The final 100 yards were a nightmare stitched together from blood and smoke and terror. German grenades rained down from above, and each explosion threw dirt and shrapnel into the air, tearing men apart or hurling them back down a hill like ragdolls. I remember the sound of it most vividly, the deep, meaty thud of explosions, the high-pitched whine of fragments spinning through the air, the guttural cries of the wounded, and somewhere underneath it all, the low, steady hum of my own breathing, ragged and desperate. Near the crest, I caught sight of Sergeant Michaels again, silhouetted against the burning sky, leading a handful of men in a last desperate rush toward the German trenches. I scrambled to follow, my boots slipping on blood-slicked stones, my rifle almost torn from my hands as I pulled myself over the lip of the ridge. The first German soldier I saw was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 17, his face pale under his coal scuttle helmet, his eyes wide with terror as he fumbled with his rifle. I don't remember pulling the trigger, but I remember the way he crumpled, as if all the strength had just poured out of him at once. There was no time to think, no time to feel. The trench was chaos, a brutal melee of fists and rifles and knives, the air thick with screams and smoke and the metallic stench of blood. I fought because there was no other choice, striking and stabbing and firing at shapes that moved in the smoke, driven by pure instinct. I felt a bayonet slash across my shoulder, a sharp burning pain that barely registered in the madness, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I wondered if this was it. If this was where my story ended, not with a heroic charge or a noble sacrifice, but in a dirty trench on a nameless ridge in a country I had never even seen before the war. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The remaining Germans, those who could still move, broke and ran, their weapons abandoned, their shouts fading into the distance as they vanished into the ruins beyond. We stood there, gasping, bleeding, too exhausted to even cheer. The ridge was ours, but it felt like a hollow victory, the cost measured not in captured ground, but in the empty places where friend had stood just moments before. I sank to my knees, the weight of it all pressing down on me harder than any physical wound. Around me, the survivors moved in a slow, stunned daze, checking weapons, tending wounds, whispering names that would never be answered. The sky above was an angry bruise of smoke and fire, and for a moment, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. But there was no time to mourn, no time to count the cost. We were given a few precious minutes to regroup, to drink from battered canteens, to patch up what wounds we could with shaking hands. The officers moved among us, barking orders, pointing toward the shattered remains of St. Lo in the distance, where the next phase of the operation waited. The Germans would not give up easily. They never did. As I sat there, cradling my aching shoulder and trying not to think about how many men we had left behind on that cursed slope, I realized something that chilled me deeper than any wound ever could. This was just the beginning. The ridge was only the first step. Ahead lay more battles, more blood, more death. The road to Paris was open, but it would be paved with the broken bodies of those too stubborn or too unlucky to make it to the other side. And somewhere out there, the enemy was already digging in, waiting for us. Waiting for me. We moved again before the sun could sink below the horizon, our battered company threading through the shattered remains of St. Lo, a city that no longer resembled anything built by human hands but rather looked like the bones of a long-dead giant, picked clean by vultures and left to bleach under the brutal sun. Rubble clogged every street, walls leaned precariously or lay collapsed in choking heaps, and a heavy smell of dust, smoke, and something far fouler filled the air, catching in the back of the throat and refusing to be swallowed down. Somewhere in the ruins, a dog barked once, high and sharp, a lonely sound that only made the silence feel heavier, more oppressive. Orders came down fast and hard. Secure the crossroads by nightfall. Hold it until reinforcement arrived. Simple words that in reality meant squeezing our exhausted bodies into the ruins, setting up hasty perimeters, and praying we could hold off whatever counterattack the Germans might throw at us during the night. Nobody said it out loud, but we all knew. The enemy would not let us have this ground without a fight, not after the way we had broken through their lines that morning. They would be furious, desperate, and desperate men fought harder than any general's order could ever make them. I was assigned a position near what had once been a cafe, the sign hanging drunkenly by one hinge, the front windows blown out and glass crunching underfoot with every step. With me were Alvarez, his head hastily bandaged and one eye almost swollen shut, and a kid named Tommy Rourke, barely 18, still baby-faced under the layer of grime and fear. We set up our position behind the wreck of a delivery truck, its cab burned out, the metal twisted into grotesque shapes that made it oddly perfect for cover. We could see down two of the main streets from there, and if anything moved, anything at all, we were supposed to open fire without hesitation. The minutes dragged by in thick, sticky silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart beat too loudly in your chest. Every shifting shadow, every creak of broken timber, every gust of wind sent a jolt through our bodies. We were wound-tight as piano wire, nerves frayed to the breaking point. The horizon burned with the fading light of the day, turning the wreckage into a surreal landscape of twisted silhouettes and long, grasping shadows. It felt like the kind of place where the dead might decide to rise, if only to scream out their rage at the living who dared tread among their broken dreams. Night fell completely, a deep, suffocating blackness broken only by the flickering of distant fires and the occasional flare that hissed up into the sky, casting everything below into stark, sickly light for a few seconds before dying out again. In that strange, stuttering illumination, the ruins seemed to move and breathe, and it was easy, far too easy, to imagine figures lurking just beyond sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. We didn't have to imagine for long. The first shots came just after midnight, short, sharp cracks of rifles from the north end of the square, followed by the deeper bark of machine guns and the harsh, ragged cries of men in combat. Our section tensed, hands tightening on weapons, eyes scanning the darkness. I caught movement at the edge of a pile of rubble, a shadow flitting too quickly to be anything natural, and without thinking, I squeezed the trigger, the M1 Garand kicking hard against my shoulder. The figure went down, crumpling into the debris, but even as it fell, more shapes surged forward. The Germans had found us, and they came with a fury that was almost beautiful in its terrible, unstoppable momentum. Grenades arced through the night, thudding into the ground with bone-rattling force, and gunfire blazed in short, frantic bursts. They came through the rubble, slipping through gaps in the walls, appearing out of holes in the ground, as if the very earth itself was vomiting them up. We fired until our rifles smoked and our fingers ached from pulling the triggers, reloading and firing again. The world reduced to flashes of light, bursts of noise, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear in the mouth. Somewhere in the chaos, I lost sight of Alvarez, and when I finally spotted him again, he was slumped against the burned-out truck, blood soaking through the bandage on his head, his rifle lying useless in his lap. I crawled over to him, dragging him back behind better cover while bullets whipped overhead, whispering nonsense words under my breath, the kind of half-prayers and curses a man says when he knows he's well beyond anyone's help. Tommy was still firing, his face twisted in a grimace that looked almost more like a grin, but there was no laughter in it, only the wide-eyed terror of a boy trying not to die before he'd even lived. We held a crossroads because we had no choice, because retreat meant death, because somewhere behind us, more men were counting on us to keep the road open. The fighting raged for what felt like forever, until the ammunition pouches grew light and the barrels of our rifles scorched our hands. Finally, the German assault faltered, broke, and melted back into the ruins from which it had come. Silence fell again, but it was a different kind of silence, not the tense waiting quiet of before, but a heavy, exhausted hush filled with the low moans of the wounded and the occasional, stuttering cough of a man too tired to die properly. In the uncertain light of a flare, I saw the square littered with bodies, twisted and sprawled where they had fallen, friends and enemies alike. There was no triumph in it, no elation. Only the grim knowledge that we had survived one more night in hell, and that tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, we would be asked to do it all again. I sat back against the ruined truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely light a cigarette, and watched as the first pale fingers of dawn crept over the horizon, staining the sky a sickly gray. Somewhere beyond the ruins, beyond the smoke and the blood and the broken dreams, lay Paris, a shining promise we had almost dared to believe in. But between us and that distant hope stretched mile after mile of enemy territory, and every step would have to be fought for, bled for, earned with the lives of men like Alvarez, like Tommy, like Michaels, like me. The battle was won, but the war, the real war, was just getting started. And in the gathering light of morning, as the fires guttered out and the dead stared blindly at the sky, I understood for the first time what it meant to be truly alive. Not safe, not whole, but alive, stubbornly, fiercely, almost in defiance of a world determined to tear itself apart, and somehow impossibly ready for whatever came next. When the full sun finally dragged itself above the jagged skyline of the ruined city, it bathed the wreckage in a pale, unforgiving light that stripped away the night's illusions and left only the raw, ugly truth in its place. There were no banners waving, no crowds cheering our victory, only the low groan of the wounded and the quiet shuffle of boots as we moved among the bodies, searching for anyone who still clung to life or anything useful we could salvage. Dust hung in the still air, sparkling like tiny broken mirrors, and every breath filled our lungs with a taste of ash and sorrow. Somewhere, the distant pop of small arms fire reminded us that even though this crossroads was ours for now, the enemy had not retreated far, and soon enough they would test us again. I stumbled through the debris-strewn square, numb to the sights that would have broken me just a few weeks earlier, the crumpled forms of men half buried under rubble, the blank, staring eyes turned skyward, the torn uniforms that made it hard to tell friend from foe. In war, even the dead lose their identities if you give it enough time and enough violence. I found Tommy slumped against the blackened remains of a wall, his rifle still gripped in both hands, his head tilted forward as if he'd simply fallen asleep sitting up. When I touched his shoulder, he tipped over slowly, revealing the neat dark hole just below his helmet, and I stood there for a long moment, staring down at him, feeling nothing at all. Maybe it was better that way. I thought better to feel nothing than to risk being crushed by the weight of it all. There would be time to mourn later, if later ever came. For now, survival demanded something more brutal, something colder. The ability to step over the fallen, to set your jaw and move forward, to pretend that the man you had shared a foxhole with, had joked and smoked and cursed the mud with, was not lying there cooling in the dust like so much discarded meat. The orders came down swiftly, with that same detached efficiency that seemed almost obscene after the night we had endured. No time to linger. No time to bury the dead. We were moving again, pushing deeper into the countryside, the great breakout Operation Cobra demanded, driving the Germans back and opening the road to Paris. The brass said it with pride in their voices, but to the rest of us, it sounded less like a promise and more like a death sentence. We packed up what little we had, gathered our wounded, left the bodies where they fell, and marched onward, the tattered remnants of our unit threading through the burnt-out ruins like ghosts still bound to a world that no longer made sense. The fields beyond St. Lo were a strange, broken place. Wide stretches of earth churned into endless mud by the pounding of thousands of shells, interspersed with the blackened skeletons of trees and the twisted wreckage of tanks and trucks. The living hedgerows that had once lined every lane and field were shattered, scorched down to stumps, or ripped apart by the relentless bombardment. The few cows and horses that remained stumbled through the ruins, ribs showing through torn hides, their eyes as hollow and haunted as our own. It was a land where life clung by the barest thread, and even the wind seemed reluctant to stir the heavy, fetid air. We advanced in fits and starts, sometimes covering a few miles in a day, sometimes barely moving at all, pinned down by sniper fire or sudden counterattacks from German rearguards desperate to buy time for their comrades to escape. Every village, every crossroads, every hilltop became a miniature battlefield, fought for with blood and fire and ferocity that seemed all out of proportion to the shattered scraps of territory we gained. Names like Marigny, Coutances, Avranches, places we had never heard of before, were etched into our memories with the sharp, painful precision of bullets and loss. It was during one of those endless, brutal pushes that I first heard the rumors, whispered among the men, passed from squad to squad like a secret too dangerous to say aloud. They said the Germans had unleashed something new, something worse than any tank or machine gun. Some swore it was a new kind of weapon, something that could turn a whole company into ash in the blink of an eye. Others spoke of strange lights at night, unexplainable disappearances, field where even the birds wouldn't fly. Most of us laughed it off. Fear and exhaustion made men see ghosts in every shadow. But the quiet moments, when the night pressed too close and the stars seemed far too distant, even the bravest among us wondered what horrors still lay ahead. The breakthrough finally came in late July, a moment that should have felt like triumph but instead tasted like ashes. The German lines collapsed under the combined weight of our armored divisions and endless air strikes, and we surged forward, rolling over their crumbling defenses like a tidal wave. I watched entire columns of enemy soldiers surrender, their faces hollow and gray, the fire gone out of them. It was supposed to be a victory, and maybe it was, but as we marched through the ruined countryside, stepping over the dead and the dying, it was hard to tell who had really won and who had merely survived a little longer. Paris lay ahead, a glittering promise on the horizon, and the generals spoke of liberation, of honor, of the final, inevitable defeat of tyranny. But for men like me, battered and broken and carrying the invisible scars of too many battles, Paris was just another place on the map, another checkpoint on a road paved with blood and shattered dreams. We had survived Operation Cobra, we had broken through. But in doing so, we had left pieces of ourselves scattered across the fields of Normandy, pieces that no victory parade or medal would ever be able to put back together. In the quiet hours before the next push, I would sometimes sit apart from the others, smoking what few cigarettes I could scrounge, staring up at the endless sky. I thought of home, of the dusty streets of my small town, of the people who would never understand what we had seen, what we had done, what we had lost. I thought of Tommy, of Alvarez, of all the faces that now lived only in memory. And I thought of the road ahead, stretching out into the unknown, a road lined with the ghosts of the past, and the promise of a future none of us dared to fully believe in. The war was not over. Not yet. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a sense, faint, fragile, but real, that maybe, just maybe, the end was somewhere out there waiting. And when it came, if it came, I knew I would carry this place with me forever. The mud and the blood and the fire etched into my bones, a silent testament to the price we paid to be free. Because in the end, that's all any of us really had. The memory of the ones we lost, the scars we bore, and the stubborn, defiant heartbeat that refused to stop no matter how many times the world tried to crush it. That was Operation Cobra. That was the beginning of the end. And that was the day I learned what it truly meant to live through hell and still find the strength to walk forward into whatever darkness lay beyond.